welcome. This is Dr. Philip Magness from AIER, and he is Senior Research Faculty and Interim Research and Education Director at AIER. And he's coming to discuss the danger of authoritarian responses to climate change. So please give a warm welcome to Dr. Magness.
All right. So I'm going to be drinking through my lecture. Remove the face mask for a little bit, if that's all right. I want to talk to you about a topic that has really come into the news in the past 2.5 years, I guess. How long have we been flattening the curve? That's the question. The last few years, and that is the rise of scientific technocracy as a mechanism for policymaking. And all of the occasion that we're looking at tonight relates to environmental policy. It also relates to COVID policy, which is what we've been living under for coming up on, I guess, 2 years now. And in framing this, I want to look at some parallels between the ways that we have approached both very real problems in the world. The one being that, I don't think anyone denies that the pandemic is a very serious event and is unprecedented in human history, recent human history, and the level of the speed at which it spread and the global response that was mustered behind it. Yet at the same time, it's relatively mild by historical standards in terms of pandemics. And then at the same time, a much larger discussion has been going on for several years on the question of climate change, global warming, carbon as a major issue of public policy, carbon abatement as a major issue of public policy. And both of these areas of policymaking often hear a very familiar refrain. That refrain is, trust the science, follow the science. And the idea here is that, science dictates what we should do. All we need to do is implement it. I'm going to try and introduce a couple twists to that that derive from economic reasoning and economic reasoning applied in the policy sphere, which we refer to as public choice theory. So those of you that have taken advanced classes in econ, you've probably encountered this before. If not, it's a relatively simple concept to start to adapt, but it's starting to look at the way that humans respond to incentives, not just in market transactions, but in policy transactions. When policy is made by government, it's often very hard to implement, as we've seen directly over the last 2 years in the pandemic response, and as we are likely to anticipate in the environmental side of the discussion. So I want to link those two. I'll start with a little bit of words of wisdom from the economist Friedrich Hayek, who is a famous little quote here. He pointed out that the curious task of economics is to demonstrate to men how little they really know about what they imagine they can design. He's talking about economic design, central planning, in that particular passage. But I'm going to argue tonight that this also extends more broadly to science-based policymaking in any scientific endeavor, really. There is always a tension between knowledge to address a problem, knowledge that a problem exists, and the designs that are brought to bear to hopefully abate the problem, but oftentimes they go quite astray. So on this subject, I'm going to start with a short history of COVID. I guess when I first made this, it was a very short history of COVID. 2 weeks to flatten the curve became 2 years to flatten the curve. But we can go all the way back to February 17th, 2020. Seems like a while ago now. USA Today, top disease official. And no one knew of this guy at the time. This was before he became famous. Maybe people that worked in the health profession knew of him. Maybe some remembered him from the AIDS crisis in the 1980s. But he was not a household name at the time. And he went in USA Today, and what did he announce? The risk of the coronavirus to the USA is, quote, minuscule. Skip the mask and wash your hands. That changed quite a bit. March 2020, 2 weeks to flatten the curve. That was our simple solution. Anyone seen this movie? Oh, Brother, Where Art Thou? It's a great, yeah. You got George Clooney. He's asking for a product at the store, and they're in the middle of nowhere, Mississippi, and the counter says, well, that'll be 2 weeks. There's his response. Ain't this a geographical oddity? 2 weeks from everywhere. Well, 2 years later, the new normal. There's your brief history of COVID.
That sums it up.
That pretty much sums it up, unfortunately. Follow the science. And yet we still hear following the science. Yeah, Fauci starts, that's not a big deal. Just wash your hands. And that's 2 weeks. It is kind of a big deal, but we'll be over it in 2 weeks. And then here we are. But I want to dig into a little bit more of this because the approach that was given to our response to this pandemic when we first had knowledge of it was to turn to scientific expertise and simply follow the expressions of scientific expertise, implement it, and then in 2 weeks later, we will have flattened the curve. Problem over. Yeah, there's probably still be some elements of the pandemic going, but we would have brought it under control if only when everyone did their part. We've all heard that. We all remembered it. We thought we were going home for spring break and would be back maybe a month later and life would be back to normal. But it didn't quite work out that way. Why? Because we had lockdowns. And lockdowns were supposedly the prescribed policy that worked. The scientific evidence. What was the scientific evidence about lockdowns prior to, let's say it was February 2020. That's a good starting point for the pandemic, at least when it gets on everyone's radar. What did scientists say about lockdowns prior to that? Do lockdowns work? There's a good question. At least mainstream epidemiology said absolutely not prior to about February, March 2020. And you don't believe me. Some of you may have. Some of you may have read some of this material. There's an article from a group of top epidemiologists at Johns Hopkins University's Pandemic Response Center. Basically, the people that produced all the COVID statistics, the centerpiece of our COVID data response. This was in 2005, and I'll read you a few excerpts from that. There are no historical observations or scientific studies that support confinement by quarantine of possibly infected people for extended periods of time. They're talking about influenza. And then it gets really fun as you go further down at the end. It says, it's difficult to identify circumstances in the past half century when large-scale quarantine, i.e. lockdown, have been effectively used to control any disease. And then they go so far as to announce that this mitigation measure should be eliminated from serious consideration, period. Yeah.
And is that because they had conclusive evidence that lockdown attempts don't work? Or is it because they hadn't been able to find any cases where they do work?
That's a great question. So the best evidence that they had was the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic. And they had studied empirically after the flu pandemic. This is the big thing in medicine for about a decade beyond it. In 1927, the US government and the American Medical Association commissioned a statistical study of pandemic response measures in 1918. And they asked the question by comparing cities where they had quarantines and they also had mask mandates. They had all the usual stuff that we've come to know. Maybe they called it by slightly different names. And one of the big findings of this, they found a good place to study this was military bases. Because military bases are kind of command and control. The commander of the base says, you do this, and every soldier implements it. And they found that I think it was about 70 to 75% of military bases went into what we would call a lockdown in response to influenza arriving on the base. This is a much more virulent disease than COVID. And then the other 25% or so did not. And they found no difference, no statistical difference in the case numbers or the fatality rates between the bases that did and did not. And then they also looked at some cities. And basically the gist of it is all the historical studies of this said, well, you know, these measures were tried, non-pharmaceutical interventions, and they didn't seem to really make the difference that was thought to be the benefit here. So they've really advised against it. And this became mainstream epidemiology thereafter. What did change, and this is where we get into the fun part of our story, is the introduction of computer modeling into the equation. And that's the source of where the lockdown idea kind of resurged or was rediscovered. Here's another passage. This is September 2019. The same team at Johns Hopkins put out a pandemic influenza plan. Basically offered it to the commission by the World Health Organization. And what did they say about lockdowns in September 2019? Quarantine measures will be least effective for pathogens that are highly transmissible, have short incubation periods, and spread through true airborne mechanisms, as opposed to droplets. Does that sound familiar? And they're basically kind of describing what have been found to be the characteristics of COVID. And they said it's not going to work, and they go into lengthy discussion of this. And there's a really interesting one. They say in some cases, implementation of the NPIs, such as travel restrictions and quarantine, might be pursued for social or political purposes rather than because of public health evidence. And this report also ties in to what the WHO published in 2019. They did a full assessment of the scientific literature on pandemic mitigation policies, both therapeutic and non-pharmaceutical, which is the category here. That was their assessment of what they called the large-scale quarantine measures, basically the precursor to what we now know as lockdowns. And you can see right up there, the overall strength of recommendation. The WHO says not recommended. And here's what they point out in the knowledge gaps. Most of the currently available evidence on the effectiveness of quarantine was drawn from simulation studies, which have a low strength of evidence. There's no randomized controlled trials. They also go into some of the literature from 1918, and they say, look, we tried this, it didn't work. So they said, not recommended. In our last piece of lockdown assessment from this guy on January 24th, 2020, he goes on CNN right after the Wuhan region of China imposed its first lockdown the day before. This is what he tells them. Something that I don't think we could possibly do in the United States. I can't imagine shutting down New York or Los Angeles. And he says, the question is, historically, when you shut things down, it doesn't have a major effect. He was summarizing that evidence. You know, a month later, he was advocating shutting down New York and Los Angeles. Did the science change that suddenly and that dramatically in the course of only a month? I'd argue no. What did change was an elevation of scientific planning, technocratic planning. And this is a very different form of technocratic planning, but this is where I draw some of the ideas, and we're going to look at it and how it plays out both in COVID and then jump over in environmental policy. Has anyone ever seen this picture before? It's actually a fairly famous character. That is exactly it. That is A.W. Phillips, the economist, Keynesian economist. He's the Phillips Curve, if you've encountered that idea, is named after him. Although there's a little bit of a weird story on how it became the Phillips Curve. He first posited the relationship, and then other economists built upon it. But he also had an interesting idea in the 1950s. He built a machine that was like a water-based computer. You see fish tanks, connected fish tanks with pumps and pipes between them, and they were an attempt to model the circular flow diagram of an economy. And there's like a standard textbook version of it. And what he thought is, if we have captured all elements of the macroeconomy, and this comes to, you see your basic components of the GDP formula there, if you've taken Macro 101, even if not, you've seen elements of this in the discussion. His whole notion here was that if you could model the entire economy, you could find the points where you exercise fiscal and monetary controls to change and achieve outcomes that you desire. So if there's a slowdown happening and you need a fiscal stimulus, you turn a knob on the computer, and that would be an equivalent of a certain policy being enacted that stimulates the economy. And then you could calculate where that monetary or fiscal injection spreads across the entire system based on this computer. So it's a hydraulic computer, and subsequent attempts have tried to turn this into an actual computer, like a modeling-based computer, a probabilistic computer. And what I argue is there's actually a lot of similarity between that machine and what some of the epidemiologists thought that they were doing at the outset of COVID. They had a similar injection point model or intervention point model and it's referred to in epidemiology as the SIR model, susceptibility, infection, recovery. So the stages at which you engage in a policy intervention are supposed to alter the outcome, the death rate. Who's this guy? Well, it's Neil Ferguson. But Neil Ferguson also has some complications around him. He's not very attuned to democratic governance, and you can read that in his own words. This is an interview he gave in December 2020, so about a year into COVID. But he's important because he is one of the main theoretical modelers. Remember that WHO report that said in fall of 2020 that the idea behind quarantines is theoretical models? Well, he was one of the guys that did the first major influenza theoretical model. And if you look at this thing, it's a simulation. It's an agent-based simulation model, actually drawn out of economics. So if anyone tells you why are economists commenting on epidemiology, I have the answer for you. It's because you're using our methods. But the idea here is they model an entire society. And he said in other interviews, he got this idea out of the video game SimCity that people played in the late 1990s. You take an entire society, you can statistically calculate, the age range for that society. You put in parameters, you approximate the number of times human beings contact each other. And then if you know the transmission rate of a disease and then also the fatality rate of a disease, you can conceptually model how many people will get it and then how many of the people that get it will die over the course of basic interactions. We're on a probabilistic computer model that simulates how many times individuals contact each other over the course of a given period, a day, whatever you want to call it. And that is supposed to estimate the transmission of the disease. And then it becomes very easy from there. You pick your intervention points, your technocratic intervention points. Lockdown when the disease prevalence reaches this level. Close schools when it reaches another level. It's exactly what we saw. And he was the prescriptive modeler that said to do this. Not the only one, but the major influence because he convinced the US and UK governments and then the rest of the Western world followed. But here we have this interesting claim about where he gets the idea. Because he thought originally he had kind of this pie in the sky. If we lock everyone down, it would solve the disease, but this isn't compatible with the constitutional Western democracy. But he sees China doing it. And then he saw Italy started to copy China. He's like, aha, we can get away with this under emergency powers. And he really kind of embraced that. Sound good? Did it work? There's the great question. And this is what I'm going to premise my argument on. Well, turns out that the Imperial College model had a lot of problems in it. And I just summarized a few of them. It ran against both the World Health Organization, Johns Hopkins, and the CDC's own pandemic response plans from 2019. And I showed you direct evidence from that, as well as quite a bit of the epidemiology profession. But nonetheless, it was seen as the hot new scientific idea that we should follow. March 16th, 2020 is the day that Ferguson announced and published his model for the US and UK. And then about 10 days later, they published for a similar model. It's slightly simplified, but same ideas and parameterized in a really similar way for 189 countries around the globe. And it was all based on this idea. You take your intervention points, you'll stop the pandemic if you enact lockdowns and all these other measures when you are supposed to, according to the model. Problems. Number one, the contact rates and the reductions for each of these policies were little more than guesstimates. And you can read in the original report, it says, well, if we close schools, in-person contacts in the public will reduce by 50%, but they'll increase in the household because the kids are home by 25%. And every one of these steps has something similar to that, but they're always nice round numbers. It's 25%, 30%, 75% here. It's never 76.3% that we achieved by randomized controlled test. It's a hard-coded guesstimate into the model. Well, if you do that enough, your model is always going to give you the same outcome, no matter what. So that's problem number one. Problem number two, and I found this by digging into the original papers that this model was built upon, originated back in 2006 as influenza models. They intentionally excluded certain circumstances, prisons and in particular nursing homes, from their entire model design because they didn't have enough evidence to say how this would transmit in a closed system type of an environment where there's a large group of people living under the same roof. What do we know about nursing homes? Well, in the United States, less than 1% of the population lives in nursing homes. And at the 1 year point of COVID, nursing homes accounted for a full 40%, give or take, of all deaths. That's an astounding figure. We don't know the exact number because what happened in New York, Governor Cuomo covered it up. So there's an error in the model, and then there's guesstimation in the model. What's that going to yield? Is that going to be a very useful or predictive result? And this is from the paper I published, the 1 year performance rate of the imperial model for all 189 countries. I used their three main scenarios that they looked at. Unmitigated spread. Mitigation was probably the closest to what most countries did. That's lockdowns and social distancing and business closures, although not like welding people in their homes like China did. And then they had a suppression model, which was more like the China model, but sustained for an entire year. And you can see the results there. And that's mortality estimations. Yeah.
And forgive me if this is jumping ahead
Sure.
of the thread of the argument here, but would you say that's an opportunity to study this and improve those numbers in the model?
It absolutely is, if they had been willing to do that. And so far, I've not seen. There is a self-adjusting model from the IHME group out of University of Washington, which is it's a different approach to this. Unfortunately, I think what it does, it uses a good statistical technique, but it uses it poorly. And the way that it uses it poorly is it continues to retroactively update itself. So you converge upon reality at any given point in the immediate near future, even though their distant projections in the future are way, way out there, and they've been wrong most of the time. So it looks like it's constantly self-updating, and that constant self-update looks like it's converging on reality, even though if you went back 6 months ago and saw what they were projecting for reality today, it'd be completely off. So yeah, there is some opportunity here. Unfortunately, it's become so politicized that we haven't adjusted. Yeah, it's kind of scary of what's going on here. And you even have newer releases of the imperial model have predicted all sorts of wild, crazy things that never happened in the UK. But yeah, that's the 1 year test of the original model, the most influential one. You saw they overestimated for 2 or 3 scenarios, 189 out of 189 countries, the number of deaths. And then only the suppression one, the China style, weld them in their houses and keep that in place for a year. 170 out of 189 countries overestimated. And you can see both the maximums and then the median mortality overestimates for each of these series. Some of the worst instances, they were 1.7 million percentage points off in one of the countries that they looked at. And of course, this has changed because, pandemic has continued for another year, but I think this is a good benchmark. And importantly, all these projections were supposed to peak in summer 2020. So this is a whole year, and the peaks have actually staggered at different points. Why do I show this? And what do I think the lesson here is that technocracy, even though it could conceivably help us to conceptualize what we are doing, turns out to be a very bad and dangerous guide for the science if you express overconfidence in what it can achieve. And that overconfidence happens simultaneously with errors that are built into the technocratic model. And so opens up a whole other set of questions, because not only is technocracy present in COVID policy, it's also present in other areas of policy. Anyone remember this guy, Captain Planet, the cheesy cartoon from like the 1980s that he battled environmental villains? Which brings us to environmental technocracy. There is a link between the two, and that link is actually explicit. Really, the premise of what got me working on this particular talk, and what will eventually be some articles out of it, was an article that came out in the American Political Science Review just over, I think it was a month or December 2021. So it's fairly recent issue. Top journal in political science. This is a career maker, if you get this. And if you read the article's arguments, political legitimacy, authoritarianism, and climate change, the article is actually a defense of authoritarian power regimes, authoritarian exercises in policy in response to existential threats and emergencies in whatever sector happens to be facing that. And he says the salient example of the COVID-19 pandemic, during which we saw severe limitations on free movement association, i.e. lockdowns, border closures, as legitimate techniques of government, illustrated a model that could be extrapolated and used in other areas of social science, other areas of policy. And he says the one that we should pay attention to the most is climate change. Consequently, I argue legitimacy may require a similarly authoritarian approach to climate change. Does this sound familiar to other areas of policy? What about counterterrorism? We've heard this argument before. After 9/11, it was, well, this is an emergency. We have to suspend normal activities of life, mostly on like airplanes. And we instituted the TSA, all of that fun, which has never gone away, never been relaxed. Even though the evidence behind it doing anything. I mean, y'all have been to airports. Do you think the TSA is a trustworthy and effective agency? Yeah, there's a strange track record there. They occasionally do all these tests where the government itself will send someone with a fake bomb through or a fake gun, and like ridiculous amounts get through the TSA screeners, like 50% failure rates and stuff whenever they try these things. So it's yeah, questionable. And yet what we find is that this is a recurring theme of history. Whenever there's an emergency, there's a tension with basic conceptions of rights, basic conceptions of institutions, and mechanisms by which we enact policy. One could argue that in the face of an emergency, through democratic mechanisms of, say, a Congress, of elected legislature that represents the people could vote to suspend their own rights through due deliberation. And in a pure democratic regime, or at least the political philosophy behind it says that, yeah, that could be a legitimate exercise. But what we find in many of these cases, did Congress ever vote to impose a lockdown? Did Congress ever vote to impose executive branch emergency measures in times of war? It's actually usually someone else that is the leader on that, and Congress at best comes back and ratifies it retroactively. And we saw that all over the world in COVID. There was even a case in New Zealand after their first lockdown. Like 3 months later, the New Zealand Supreme Court says this was done unconstitutionally, but it's an emergency, so we can't go back and undo it. I was like, yeah, you broke the law, but oh well, highest court in the land. So I think this is a really dangerous level of argument that's being made. And to see it deployed in environmental policy becomes even more problematic, because environmental policy is often posed to us in catastrophic terms, in apocalyptic terms, that if we do not address climate change and do not address it through all of these preferred mechanisms that are supposedly the science, and do not do it now, what's going to happen? The ice caps melt, the polar bears die, our cities flood, massive catastrophe. And I'm not denying that there's climate change. I'm not denying that global warming has scientific basis behind it. I am questioning the policy mechanisms, and that's what I want to turn my attention to. And the oddity here is we can go through a little bit of a historical story in itself. And I've jokingly, but also somewhat seriously, called this climate activism as an ideology in search of a perpetual justification. And I don't mean to say that climate change is in search of a perpetual justification. Probably the best science we have shows a long-term trend of the globe warming, temperatures warming. What do we do about it? That's the policy question. But nonetheless, there's a a common set of arguments that have played out. And actually, if you go back to read the literature on climate activism, basically from the 1970s to the early 2000s, there was a really in vogue theory that was referred to as peak oil theory. What was peak oil theory? What started with a mathematical certainty that there's like a curve you can actually trace out of all the fossil fuels that are non-renewable resources that exist on Earth. There's only a finite amount of oil. We don't know where it all is, but there is at some point a finite amount of oil, or at least if it replenishes it, it's a multi-million year process of stuff breaking down, organic matter breaking down. But the peak oil theory assertion was that you would hit at some point, based on oil and other carbon extraction, an absolute maximum, a peak, after which there would be a rapid decline. And the argument that was put forth early in the version of this is that depletion would occur as a mathematical certainty at some point in the future. And when it happens, it would probably outpace our ability to adjust if we are still technologically dependent on fossil fuel. So therefore, what do? You invest in other mechanisms besides fossil fuel. And of course, this is all tied because carbon emissions do create global warming. So there's a parallel reason that they want to do this, but they say the real exigency is peak oil. And this needs to be reversed. It came really into vogue in the 1980s, 1990s in the environmental literature, but the policy prescriptions are more or less the same of what we hear today for carbon. Well, after the early 2000s, it became evident that we're nowhere near the peak extraction. And in fact, oil and other carbon-based fossil fuels are far more abundant than we thought at the time in the 1980s. So it's like fun if you go back to read environmental science textbooks in the 80s versus the 90s, 90s versus the 2000s. So they're constantly changing the projection dates of when the catastrophe is supposed to happen. But there was a very sudden switch in the language of how we contextualize fossil fuel. It's no longer non-renewable and at the edge of imminent depletion. It's non-renewable still, but there's too much of it in the ground. So therefore, we have to sequester it. There's too much of it in the ground, and if we in fact used all that was in the ground, it'd be runaway global warming, which maybe there's a scientific validity to that claim that yes, massive amounts of carbon consumption based on fossil fuel resources would lead to a much warmer climate. But there's a rhetorical twist that occurred there, but the solution, notice, is the same. So it's like adapting a set of solutions. See the commonalities here, and I put them side by side. Alternative energy was like a priori assumed to be the solution. Subsidized wind, solar, etc. Discourage fossil fuel use. It used to be before it's exhausted, then it shifted to because there's too much of it. And I think there's some validity there. Yeah, go ahead. I think what they did is they misestimated. And this is a common thing in resource economics as well. The food discussion. Any of y'all know the economist Thomas Malthus? So his historical projection was that population growth would outpace, it was destined to outpace our ability to sustain human beings with food and other resources for consumption. Therefore, you're destined to like perpetual famines. And what it comes down to is that there was a basic misestimation in his original work, and that error was compounded also because he saw consumption patterns as like a static thing, and production patterns as a very static part of human history. And actually what we find is that we're changes in technologies that alter. So a really similar pattern played out in fossil fuels as played out in food production in the 19th century. So in the late 20th, early 21st century, you get a similar pattern with fossil fuels. So that's kind of the issue here. Yeah. Fracking is one of the major, but it's also just more efficient uses of the same fuel. And there are also adaptations to not just coal and oil. There are other types of natural fossil fuels and biofuels that have been added into the mix. There's all sorts of things that it's a multi solution or multi product type of an approach to producing energy. And as technology has improved, it's vastly expanded efficiency and the number and the uses that we have of resources. And yet we still have a problem if we don't like global warming, although, cold weather, warm weather, I would argue there's subjective elements to each of preferences, and a subjective static assumption that human beings should always live in the exact same climate. So I'm not even convinced of that, but set that aside, set aside your subjective preferences. We can accept that there are externalities associated with each of these stated problems. And there's a parallel that we see between the COVID externality and the climate externality. What's externality theory? It's the concept basically comes from economics, that activities that impose costs upon other human beings or impose costs upon other things that are not incorporated in the transaction itself, or not incorporated in the activity itself. Classic example, a fireworks display. If you're shooting fireworks up into the air in a public park, all the neighbors can see it for free, whether they paid for it. They have a positive externality that's generated by the fireworks display, unless you really hate fireworks. And it could be a very negative externality. But the concept here also extends to pollution. If I dump crud in the river and someone downstream encounters that, it's not part of my economic calculation when I throw my waste in the river, but someone else is bearing the cost of it. So this is a very important tool for consideration in policy decisions. But what I want to do is challenge some displays of this tool using both the COVID example and the environmental example. Externality theory says for COVID that a failure to wear a mask, going out in public, imposing external costs of your activities increases disease transmission. Therefore, we have to disrupt it through a regulatory mechanism, i.e. lock people down or require them to wear masks, or all the different things that were asserted to work to control COVID. So it's an externality control is the policy. And we see the same thing in climate change. There's too much carbon. Carbon emissions warm the globe that cause a whole ripple effect of scientific repercussions that are probably true to some degree. The question is, what can we do about it? But the idea here is that you use either regulatory or economic tools to rein in the externality. You bar people from emitting things, or you tax it. You charge a fee. So a carbon tax is often associated with this. And what it does is try to correct the external costs of carbon emission itself. Simple enough? So how do you calculate? That's where things get really hairy. Therefore, it's right to tax or regulate or do these things, right? It's just as simple. I mean, just put the scientists in charge of the government and they say, well, there's the externality. We know how to fix that externality. Just go do it. And next issue, please come to me and tell me how you'll govern yourself. Well, externalities are really tricky. This is where I like to draw on the Nobel economist Ronald Coase, who worked very heavily in externality and property rights economics. This was what he made his mark on, why he wins the Nobel Prize. And he has this great little passage from a book he wrote late in life, where he was basically asked the question about externality control. And he says, I think about this all the time, and we can do the mathematical models that say certain types of economic mechanisms aimed at controlling externalities, whatever the policy, do seem to look like they work on paper. He says others he's doubtful of, but he has a very thorough discussion, and this is a thoughtful guy. But he comes up with an observation that's often missing from this equation. The technocratic approach often leaves out political reality. He says the fact that government intervention itself also has its costs makes it very likely that most externalities should be allowed to continue if the value of production is to be maximized. So he's talking on economic policy. He's talking in economic terms, but I think the observation is generalizable. He's saying most externalities should be allowed to continue given this constraint, the fact that governmental intervention has its costs. So then we ask the question, well, what are the costs of governmental intervention? And he has some hints here. He has a caveat. He says the conclusion that I've just asserted is strengthened if we assume that government is not like Pagu's ideal. Pagu is an earlier externality economist that worked on this, and Pagu actually would admit some of these same limitations as Coase. It's not like the ideal government that simply implements what the scientific or technocratic manager says to do. It's like a normal public authority. And what's a normal public authority? Ignorant, subject to pressure, and corrupt. The government we have versus the government we wish we had. That was Coase's observation. And he's going to say that this imposes a severe constraint on technocratic policymaking aimed at externality alleviation. Externality theory continued. And consider, what do you need to know that externality abatement is going to work, whether it's a carbon tax or a COVID lockdown or some sort of regulatory mechanism to address just about any problem that we encounter in society. One, you need a presumption that your original diagnosis of the problem was correct. And I'm not just saying we recognize that global warming is a problem, we recognize that COVID's a problem, but we know the fine details of how these problems operate, the fine details of how COVID spreads, the finer details of the exact mechanisms of how carbon warms the atmosphere. We can approximate, and we have good scientific studies that give us a general picture, but even to this day, like the transmission mechanisms of COVID are extremely hard to pinpoint. We found that out. The exact mechanisms that environmental change occurs in relation to the amount of carbon in the atmosphere is extremely difficult to pinpoint. There's always people that attribute, and they do these goofy studies that say that like the rise in earthquakes is a result of global warming, and there's some that say conflict in Africa as a result of global warming, or the Middle Eastern upflare, that the Arab Spring was a result of global warming. And it's really kind of farcical social science that leaves out a lot of confounding variables, but they try to bring it in. And I've actually studied some of the history of this. I went back and looked in old newspapers, and I found there was a scientist in 1939 that claimed that global warming caused Hitler. And his whole theory was that warmer climates made people more irritable and agitated, and therefore they voted for Hitler. And this is, I'm setting that aside while not denying the policy, but there's a presumption of a correct diagnosis. We often get way ahead of ourselves. There's also a presumption that the policy will be effective as claimed. We saw that in the lockdowns. What was Neil Ferguson's things? Oh, you just do these things that I tell you to do. Here's my model, and here's the output that you're going to get. It turns out that all of his predictions are wrong. We see similar things playing out in environmental economics all the time because there's always unintended consequences. Famous example, Mexico City banned car use by license plate on certain days of the week. And the idea was, if you have this number on your license plate, you can only drive on Thursday and Tuesday and Saturday or something. Well, what did it do? Did it cause people to reduce their driving? No. They went and bought a second car with a different license plate. And the second car was often in much worse condition than the first car, so it ended up polluting more. Things like that. So, you know, these things are really complex to figure out. And oftentimes the scientific assertion, which we saw in the Ferguson model, it left out nursing homes. The scientific assertion simply wasn't there. It missed a big part of the picture. And if you miscalculate, your policy is not going to be effective. In other words, what this tells us is that the simpler the policy, the more narrow its focus, the more likely you're going to be able to control for this. But for massive systems like climate or global human health or anything of that nature, you're talking about immense complexity that could never be captured in a computer model the way that even the most sophisticated ones that we have. There's also a presumption that the policy execution will be as exact as the technocrat says. Science says global warming is a problem, go do this. Everyone will just implement it. It turns out people don't implement things as directed. And in fact, they respond to other incentives. One of those incentives is when you use political mechanisms to reallocate resources, you generate and create new stakeholders and the recipients of those resources, the winners and the losers. We can think about this in COVID policy. Who won because of the lockdowns? Who economically benefited because of the lockdowns? Amazon, Zoom. Hi, everyone out there on Zoom. pharmaceutical, and I'm not saying that these things are bad because they benefit, and I'm not saying, oh, Amazon's greedy, Zoom's greedy. I'm saying they clearly saw their bottom lines increase because of a diversion of economic activity into those things. Who are the losers? In-person dining, retail, mom and pop shops, the travel industry. There are clear stakeholders that are generated by the enactment of this policy. Same thing would happen in any sweeping climate policy. And it's everything from the automobile manufacturers to people who drive and have to commute long distances to just all sorts of things. These are all now stakeholders, but then there's also beneficiary stakeholders. If you move away from fossil fuels and you subsidize the solar industry now becomes a government stakeholder. And what do you think they do? I guess this is where I'm getting at. If there are policy decisions that change the status quo in the reallocation of resources and do so through the instruments of government, stakeholders start to do what? They lobby to keep what they are benefiting from and lobby to prevent what could harm them. And we've seen elements of this in all sorts of policy. We just have to assume that it's going to happen. We find very ineffective and inefficient solar firms have continued to receive subsidies well beyond what would have been their natural lifespan. We see misallocation of money in these things. And I'm not saying solar is horrible or bad. I'm saying that when there's a stakeholder that's actually making money by producing solar panels, you betcha they're going to lobby for more solar. Another one in environmental policy, ethanol, corn industry. Corn industry loves its subsidies and they love environmentally conscious production of a renewable source of alcohol, basically, that you can burn, because it makes them money, not because it's good for the environment necessarily. So all these stakeholder things come into that. And what do the stakeholders do? They affect these last two bullet points here, because they change what you can actually implement because they're affecting the policy, and they change your ability to adjust the policy in real time as conditions change, as new knowledge enters in, as new discoveries are made. So you get a path dependency on the old policy because the stakeholders are behind it, not because it's the best science anymore. And if you are not considering these things, whether it's environmental or health or any other policy, and you're just proclaiming from above, implement the technocracy, you're going to set yourself up for a trap at each of these stages that's going to ultimately undermine the effectiveness of the policy. That's a more complex way of saying what Coase was warning against. Which brings us back to public health planning. And I'll close on this. I'll close on telling you a story because I think it's very illustrative of something we should consider for anything in the scientific sphere. Back in 1851, there was a cholera outbreak in England. And we've probably heard the story in the news. Very famous cholera outbreak. There's a social scientist by the name of Herbert Spencer, and he wrote this great little passage on it in an obscure chapter of a very famous book called The Social Statics. And he was observing about the nature of scientific and medical professionals to shift from advisors into interest groups themselves. And he observed that this was happening in this cholera outbreak that was occurring in London at that time. And he says that the medical profession initially started out by offering advice, then it started to turn into its own lobbying institution to perpetuate itself. The scientific advisors were no longer scientists, they were advocates. And he sees some familiar names. Take up the Lancet. What's the Lancet? We know that medical journal still exists today. And you shall find articles written to show the necessity of making poor law medical officers independent of the boards of guardians by appointing them for life, holding them responsible to only a central authority, and then giving them handsome salaries. He's saying that people could discovered, even in the sciences, to make money off of it. Which brings us to our most famous story from that cholera outbreak. Still going on in 1854, and we see this guy, that is Dr. John Snow, not the Game of Thrones character, but the physician. Dr. John Snow knew something. He discovered something very interesting in a statistical observation. He discovered that there was a cholera outbreak in a certain region of London, and he made a map, and all those little darkened houses, those are buildings that had cases of cholera. And there's some interesting observations that he noticed of this. They seem to be getting more intense as you got closer to a water source. This is the famous Broad Street pump. And it turned out it was a contaminated water source that was spreading the cholera. Problem is, he was arguing against a medical establishment. He had a new theory. How does the cholera bacteria transmit? It's by drinking tainted water, and then bad things happen. The prevailing theory at the time said that cholera transmitted by foul smells and odors in the air. Miasma was the argument. Miasma theory, not bacteria, not germs, but miasma. And Snow decided to test his theory, so he convinced the local health board to allow him to deactivate the pump. So they cut off the water source, and what happened? The cholera went away. End of story, right? Science has stepped in, and it has shown us the way. A great policy making. Sounds wonderful. That's not what happened. That's not what happened at all. You've heard it said, you've heard even the people like Fauci saying, yeah, we should follow John Snow because he fixed it with science. That's not at all what happened. Turned out there was a political establishment built up around the miasma theory of cholera transmission that was entrenched in the bureaucracy by several decades before. This is a cartoon, a political cartoon from the previous cholera outbreak in the 1830s in London. And what does it show? These are all the bureaucrats at the Board of Health, the medical professionals. And what are they doing in this cartoon? They're crawling around like sniffing the dung heaps, smelling the ground. And you can look at some of the text. I know it's kind of hard to see. One of them, the little paper, it says, looseness of the bowels is the beginning of cholera. The scent lies strong here. Do you see anything? And they're going around looking in the pigsty and in the cesspool. They're smelling for poo is basically what they thought spread cholera. And they said, if you get the smell under control, you will fix it, right? And then you see the best one on there is positively, we must find something, find the smell. It won't do to lose our 20 guineas a day. Political incentive in here. So what did they do? They thought the smell was the source of the cholera. So they figured out if we can get rid of the smell, cholera will go away, right? So they built drainage systems to wash out the cesspools, drainage systems to wash out the dirty industries. So they focused on leather and tanning and meat processing, things that cause bad smells. And they made a really effective drainage system. And what does it do? It washes it all into the River Thames. The River Thames flows downstream. There's the pump that fuels the water supply, and it pulls the drinking water out of the downstream of where all the poo has been washed. Nice. Science. So what did Mr. Snow, when he figured out that this is a very bad mechanism, do? He said, you're misdiagnosing it. It's actually the tainted water, not the smells that you're flushing into the river. The Board of Health refused him. This is the story you haven't heard. It said, the Broad Street pump did actually become a source of disease to persons at a dwelling distance. We believe that this may have depended on other organic impurities, those especially in the air, not its choleric excrements, but simply the fact of impure waters having participated in the atmospheric infection of the district. They refused him. They said, no, your theory is wrong. This goes against prevailing science, which also happened to be politicized. They ignored him for a decade. He was attacked in the medical journal, shunned by the Board of Health, told to go away, and then dies basically in obscurity. It wasn't until 1866, 12 years later, one of the old members of the Board of Health that refused him in 1854 and condemned him in 1855, there's another cholera outbreak, and he gets an idea and says, well, let's try Snow's experiment again in another city where the cholera outbreak was. Did the same experiment, and sure enough, it worked. It stopped the cholera. And he's like, shit, we were wrong. Tens of thousands of people died in between of cholera from a completely preventable disease that the science had correctly diagnosed, but had been shunned and set aside because it went against other prevailing sciences. In other words, the technocracy had misdiagnosed. So I'll conclude on that. Planning versus constitutional norms, COVID and climate. Here's the similarity. There's a presumption that the emergency necessitates overruling democratic norms, and therefore we must act, and act on expert decree, act on expert knowledge that also happens to be mistaken, wrong, and oftentimes politically subservient to pressures it doesn't recognize in its own presentation. Next step follows, the emergency never ends. There's no guarantee that the solution even works if there's been a misdiagnosis, and no guarantee that the solution even works if the policy mechanisms are in error, even if the scientific diagnosis was originally correct, as might be the case with climate change. We don't know that the solutions deliver on what they promise. We only know the problem. Demonstrable authoritarianism emerged during lockdowns. Governments set aside longstanding norms of how to make policy to declare a state of emergency that autocrats, whether executives or executive agency bureaucrats, issued decrees. It was nonetheless outside of the normal legislative participatory constitutional system that we usually use to make laws. And when that follows, you create new constituencies, those who cling to the power, those who benefit from the power. And what I'll leave you with is the final thought is, curiously, whenever we do this type of a thing, when we go down this route, which is what was advocated for in that APSR article that I showed you the intro from, it's what's often being said now based on COVID, we can do an environmental policy and other types of emergencies, whether it's terrorism, war, you name it, anything that's ever natural disaster. We execute on emergency executive power. You basically open the door for the permanent emergency, and the permanent emergency removes all safeguards that would otherwise constrain scientific error when a conflation of evidence has occurred. But the curious thing about it is, it's not the scientists that are ever the victims of this. The people that denounced Jon Snow did not lose their jobs and editorships and positions on the Board of Health. It only took until one of them finally figured out his error and reversed his position that we changed the science. It's always the least well off. It's always the people that worked in service industry jobs during COVID, or it's going to be poor people in countries that have not developed, have not industrialized yet, that do not have the benefit of access to fossil fuels. And those are the things that we have to consider as the trade-off for the policy abatement. And I think at the end of the day, if we say that the policy abatement measure recommended by the science is uncertain, weak, politically susceptible, possibly corrupt, even if the problem is real, and yet the harms of that policy are substantial, it means that poor people do not have access to transportation and technology that could improve their lives. Well, what's the cost-benefit equation? What's the cost-benefit analysis there? It says, follow Mr. Coase's advice and do not try to abate the externality. I'll end on that and open to questions. If there are any in online land, Zoom land, yeah, figure out that. Yes. Sure. Yeah, so here you get into a whole new bucket of worms here when going into an authoritarian society. So an authoritarian society that uses heavy-handed approaches also has an incentive to report that those approaches worked. And we've seen that very clearly in how China has presented its COVID statistics. If you look up on all the tracker sites, what does China's COVID outbreak look like? There's an initial spike when the disease first emerges on the scene, and then the deaths, they basically flatline for 2 years. I think like the last recorded death was sometime in maybe like April or May 2020, and there's minuscule amounts that, and China is claiming, well, this is proof that our approach worked, our heavy-handed approach worked. Do we believe those statistics? And there are other approaches to try to measure death in an unfree society, a closed society that has political manipulation of its data. What I liken something like China and COVID to is like the Soviet Union in the 1940s and 50s when it had all these central plans that were supposedly to industrialize its economy and overtake the West. And some people bought kind of the propaganda behind those plans, but there were other economists that went in and looked at indirect indicators, and they found out, well, the Soviet growth is actually maybe half of what they claim it is on paper. Similar things happening somewhere in China today, where they have a claimed very effective set of policy recommendations that interestingly enough have been very difficult to replicate anywhere else. It turns out that even countries like Australia kind of went down that route for a while with heavy-handed lockdowns. I don't know if anyone's seen the COVID stats from Australia. I say, add something like pollution into this, and you have an economy like China that is very dependent on energy production right now. They have an incentive, a political incentive, to underreport how much their emissions happen to be, even if you were to get them to agree to a regime like that. So I guess a short answer to you, a short end to this very long answer to this question is that when you have an authoritarian regime, it's not only the top-down approach, the heavy-handed approach that's being executed, the measurement of the effectiveness of that approach is distorted by the illiberal nature of the regime. And I see that as discrediting of the approach itself.
Jack has a question.
Yeah.
Yes, even if the statistics are correct, what was the cost?
What was the cost? When China or in the United States or in the rest of the world?
I believe he means China.
Yeah, in China. Well, I think we've seen some circumstantial evidence of this. There are satellite pictures that show they've built massive, like 10,000 unit quarantine camps that are being used for something. We don't know if it's COVID or what, being used for something. There are some indirect statistical indicators that show that cremations of bodies rapidly increased over the period they were claiming there's no COVID. We recently saw an entire city that was put under harsh lockdown, and people were unable to get things like groceries delivered, and where some of the leaked out pictures show people basically on the verge of starvation because they don't have access to basic resources. The lockdown that was that severe. We saw political repression even at the original outbreak of COVID. The first scientists that said, hey, we've got a problem on our hand. What did the government do? It didn't say, oh, you're the heroes for alerting the world. They said, no, this is not a problem. They made them disappear. Prosecuted people. So there are extreme costs associated with almost any authoritarian regime, even if they're claiming the heavy-handedness is an effective approach. Yeah.
Is there any examples up to this point of emergency powers being used to try and solve climate change and authoritarian?
Ooh, so I don't think there have been in the Western world attempts at executing it in this direction. I fear that there are certain policymakers that are inclined to heavy-handed approaches to climate change are seeing things like COVID, as we see in that journal article, and saying they're rubbing their hands together and saying this is our chance. We saw an emergency being used here. I mean, that's the whole argument of that piece, is that we actually surpassed what were previously considered outside of democratic norms in response to the emergency. It's like COVID opened the Overton window, therefore we should step through it with climate change and whatever else our problems happen to be. Heavy-handed, unfree societies. Again, you're back to the self-reporting thing, but I don't think they pay too much attention to environmental destruction. This is like go back and look at the Soviet Union or Eastern Europe's environmental record before the fall of the Berlin Wall and the fall of communism. It's atrocious compared to industrialized Western countries. Chernobyl is the tip of the iceberg there. That kind of stuff. And I don't think that's by accident. You can go to some of the rare earth metal production facilities in China today that are used in the turbines for wind regimes. And it's the ugliest crud you've ever seen comes out of the mining processes there. And it's really not on record, even though if you were to ask the government, they say, oh yeah, it's wonderful. We've solved the problem. And what they're really doing is they're flushing it down the river or putting it in a mine, or so it's really kind of a destructive, ugly record of more of cover-ups than of actual success. Yeah. Yeah.
Why do national fairly significant number of municipalities in the United States that use climate emergencies to make large-scale renewable energy transition?
Yeah, yeah.
There should be some evidence that it's being used.
Maybe that's a question. She says that you basically say that we should not heed negative externalities, but when it comes to environment policy, it's also a leverage that's used in international negotiations like the Paris Agreement and CO2 conference. How should policy decisions be impacted by it?
Ooh, I'll start off by saying I'm not a fan of international agreements. That was probably already evident. Yeah, I'm not a fan of international agreements for, I guess, a couple of reasons. First, they tend to be undermined by the public choice constraints. I mean, it's like taking all of the problems that are present on a national level policy and compounding them across dozens of countries. You've multiplied the number of stakeholders and interest groups that are trying to get something out of it. So there's that one problem. The other thing is the enforcement mechanisms, the mechanisms to put the implementation of the agreement into effect are also politically subservient for things like that. And what you get is a bunch of countries that agree to do one thing on paper, but then they've all built themselves out to get around it, or they just lie. In the case of unfree authoritarian regimes, they just lie and ignore it, or they push the impending deadline back further and further when it's clear they're not going to meet it. So it's a real problem, I think, of supposed science-based policy. Is scientists will endorse these often for very well-meaning reasons. They'll endorse these international agreements like the Paris Accord and say, and we've all seen the news stories, like hundreds of scientists sign a letter that say we need to be on the Paris Accord. But they're approaching it from a perspective that says, yes, if we implement the idealized version of the Paris Accord on paper exactly as it says it's going to be implemented, and everyone does their part, then it'll fix the problem. I think it's a naive way of looking at the world. It's an idealistic way of looking at the world in an aspirational sense, but it's not the political world we live in. And it's almost always the politics that undermine it. So what I'd say in answer to situations that environmental policies are absolutely real, areas of concern, environmental pollution is a problem. How do you address it? Focus local, focus through property rights regimes. Don't promise the sky, don't promise massive sweeping regulations that are supposedly going to deliver us into salvation that are nonetheless implemented by human political actors. In other words, weigh the costs and the benefits of the policy, but also weigh the political implementation of the policy as a potential cost. Yes, sir.
So going back to like the externality theory, kind of assuming that the effects of climate change are as reported.
Yeah.
Wouldn't you agree that even if we're not going to ban all cows or take those drastic measures, that there are reasonable measures that you can take to solve an externality, like cap and trade, for instance, where you at least somewhat know what the effects of it are going to be. How it can be implemented.
So I say in the broadest sense, I say absolutely there are things that could be done to address a problem of whether you want to call it carbon emissions, pollution, almost anything in that space. Are the specific policies that we're proposing, whether it's cap and trade or a carbon tax, likely to achieve that outcome? There could be some trial and error if we see certain regions attempt some things. I'm generally down on most of those policies out of the sense that I think that they are very large sweeping attempts to solve a problem through mechanisms that are easily susceptible to political capture. In other words, we propose cap and trade, or we propose carbon taxes thinking from the public benefit if they perform as needed, but we often ignore the fact that each of these policies creates a constituency interest group that's going to lobby for the perpetuation of what ends up passing, even if it needs to be changed to be effective. So in other words, you fall into a trap where the bad policy gets locked in, and attempts to tweak it and turn it in a direction to make it more effective start to be resisted by the very same people who lobbied for it in the first place. So that's the risk that I see playing out in many of these areas in kind of a Coasian sense. So, any other questions? Yeah. The one about Hayek, yeah, about the task of the economist. So yeah, we're going into very abstract theorizing here. Yeah, it's the purpose of economics is to teach people, the limitations, to demonstrate to men how little they really know about what they imagine they can design. What he's essentially saying here, this is a complex way of expressing a concept of humility of knowledge. We often defer to experts thinking, well, they figured out all the solutions. They figured out the nature of the problem. Therefore, it's easy to do what they say and you address the problem. Yeah. So Hayek's big thing, and this is one of his one of the components of why he's like an acclaimed economist, is he has a very simple observation. See, knowledge is difficult to come by. Knowledge is almost like a commodity in itself. It's scarce. There are barriers to obtaining it. We live in a state of distance from universal knowledge. We are in a, I mean, he's almost at the borderline of skepticism here when he writes. And his point is the knowledge that would be necessary to execute a very complex ordering or plan of society far exceeds the capacity of any individual human being to even grasp, or groups of human beings to even grasp, because much of that knowledge is implicit and subjective to the individual person. I don't know what each of you want for dinner tonight. I could find out by asking you. I could poll you, but I've already expended energy asking you. That's a low cost knowledge to obtain, but you start to do that interpersonally for billions of people, it suddenly becomes a problem of delivery. Do we send out a survey that every person receives at 6 p.m. every night that says, what do you want for dinner that night? And then do we use that to allocate food? So he's talking about it like in an economic planning sense. Or do you assume that knowledge, though inaccessible in the macro sense, can be localized to the individual and your own subjective preferences? And you do a pretty functional job of figuring out the task of what you want for dinner tonight. And you go and figure a way to get it in a way that may be completely different. You go to a different restaurant than somebody else, you cook a different thing than somebody else, and all of you get dinner tonight though. So Hayek is basically saying, if you approach knowledge as something that's costly to obtain, you approach knowledge as something that's not like this universalized system, but rather the best knowledge we have is the knowledge that's individual to us. It has implications for grand design. It basically makes grand design impossible. Whether it's economic planning or at least as I would argue here, we try to extend it to other areas of planning, environmental planning, health planning. In other words, any complex system has variables well beyond the capacity of human beings to anticipate and design. So that's what Hayek is saying here. All right.
I have a question that's kind of related to
Sure.
the difficulty of gathering information, and also to adaptive studies, whereas as people are
Adaptive studies, okay.
monitoring the health crisis,
Yeah.
Updating those computer models.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
A project I'm really enjoying working on right now has to do with so it's in partnership with a rangeland management organization that's doing research into ways rotate cattle over the land in a way that
Mhm.
turns around some of that desertification of the fair ground opening up from overgrazing and whatnot. And long story short, there's a lot of things that that ranchers need to monitor if they're going to implement these guidelines. Well, you're trying to figure out if the grass has been grazed too recently in this paddock. You need to put cattle on it. You need to be watching the cattle to see if they need to eat more. You need to eat more rich green grass or whatnot. So there's all these things you're trying to monitor, and based on these indicators, you change your the action you take.
Yeah.
And so the indicators you watch and the actions you take, those really vary climate to climate, season to season, depending on how dry it is or whatnot.
There should be a very localized knowledge based on where you live.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So it takes a lot of trial and error of saying, okay, we'll try it this way, this one time.
Yeah. So the discovery process through the trial and error.
Discovery process.
Yeah.
And it's really difficult because you can't just do one study and figure out the way it works.
The one size fits all approach. That's the problem.
You've got to do these really tiny little adaptive studies that are also kind of safe to fail because you don't want them to lose all their livelihood by betting the farm.
Yeah.
On some new policy.
Exactly. If you err in one area, I mean, it could all be over. Yeah.
So I'm drawn to this idea of trying to make these
keep knowledge decentralized and localized, because that gets into the Hayek point here.
Yeah.
It's that first off, the individual level is going to have the closest assessment of knowledge immediately in the proximity of that individual. That's what you
that way, but I think that gets to it because there needs to be so much feedback.
Yeah, so the best feedback mechanisms, the best feedback loop are not sending it up to a bureau somewhere 1,000 miles away where they plug it into a computer and it spits out a result and tells you back on the ground what you should do. The best feedback mechanism is looking to the guy that lives there and saying, what'd you do last year?
Yeah. Yeah.
How do you limit emergency power while still granting governors I mean, you could say it can be eliminated altogether, but I think you can probably agree that for a hurricane or something or if there was a really, really deadly pandemic, that you might need some degree of emergency power. So how do you balance that, and how do you put a limit on it to keep it from being 2.5 years later?
Yeah. This is arguably the great question of political theory, going back to the ancient world. How do you sustain a free and constitutional and constrained system of government in a society where exigencies emerge that rub up against those norms? The most famous example, I guess, in U.S. history is the American Civil War. At the outbreak of the Civil War, President Lincoln goes before Congress, and what does he say? He's under fire because he has unilaterally suspended the writ of habeas corpus. And he goes before the Congress and he says, I'm paraphrasing here, are we to allow our adherence to the Constitution to falter? Are we to allow all the laws but one, that one being habeas corpus, to go unheeded and the republic crumbles around us because of the emergency of the war? And at least rhetorically, if that were indeed the circumstance, I say, yeah, he's got an interesting point here. If you look back at the history of it and ask the question, was his suspension of habeas corpus the thing that saved the Union? Absolutely not. And in fact, the one case that he was referring to was a guy that was arrested a month after the alleged incident, and a month after the emergency had moved from the area where the incident occurred. It was outside of Baltimore. Baltimore had long since been secured, and then finally in the middle of the night, they go and arrest the guy that was alleged to and throw him in jail without a writ of habeas corpus. It's kind of like, wait a minute, the way you're describing the emergency and the reality of the execution of these powers are not aligned. If the emergency were what you described, then maybe you have a point. So I guess what I would say there is that, we can imagine in theory an issue emerging, an emergency occurring that is so severe, something drastic needs to be done. Those are a lot more rare than we're led to believe in common public. In other words, politicians tend to exaggerate their emergencies relative to their own action because everyone wants to be seen as doing something in response. And oftentimes what that also means is that emergency powers should be severely constrained to a very limited period of time because the actual emergency often passes in a matter of hours or days. And in reality, what you see is the emergency powers acted upon weeks, months, years into the claimed event as if it were an imminent threat from the first day that it occurred. So how do you design a constitutional system to address those? If I had the answer to that, I'd be a consultant to probably every government in human history. There's a problem for political theory. There is no easy answer. Someone like David Hume would say that you have very well-defined rights and a very clear constitutional system, and it's when those rights start to break down, when they start to blur, that what tends to follow in human history is death and slaughter and civil wars and all the horrible things that we don't want. So it's about the best answer I can give you. All right. I think we're, thank you again for your time. It's been a pleasure to be here with you. And
This has been a really informative talk.
I hope so.
Thank you.
All right. All right. Well, thank you.
And if